The Komeito is a Japanese political party that has been part of the ruling coalition with the Liberal Democratic Party for the better part of 20 years. And even though they have been in power for so long, they are probably one of the most overlooked and least understood aspects of modern Japanese political culture. A large part of this comes from the difficulty in categorizing the party on the conventional left versus right political spectrum. According to Professor Levi McLaughlin of North Carolina State University, when looking at the Komeito, labels such as liberal, conservative, socialist, and even social democrat aren't good terms for describing the party and its supporters, as these definitions emerge out of very specific European and American political movements in the 18 and 1900s, and therefore, they can't easily be mapped onto a modern Japanese political party without losing a great deal of historical and cultural context. Especially for a party like the Komeito that was founded as part of a 20th century Buddhist movement called the Soka Gakkai, which was itself based on the teachings of a 13th century Japanese monk named Nichiren. As a result of this, before we can talk about the Komeito, we first need to look into the Buddhist movement that first produced it. The Soka Gakkai is a congregation of Nichiren Buddhists that was first founded in the 1930s, and over the past 100 years, their membership is said to have grown to include about 10 million followers in Japan, along with 2 million more members abroad. This would mean as many as 1 in 12 Japanese citizens are affiliated with Soka Gakkai, making it one of the single largest religious denominations in the country, with its global membership encompassing a wide range of people, from single working-class mothers in rural Japan to popular Western celebrities such as Orlando Bloom. Now, although it ended up as a religious organization, the Soka Gakkai was not originally a religious movement. Instead, it was founded in the 1920s by 2 Japanese school teachers named Machiguchi Saburo and Toda Josei, who wanted to reform their local school system, with their most important influence being the American philosopher and educational reformer John Dewey, whose writings were being translated into Japanese during this time. But eventually by the 1930s, both Toda and Makaguchi ended up converting to a branch of Nichiren Buddhism, and this conversion is what gradually transformed Soka Gakkai from an educational reform movement into a more Buddhist organization. Following in the traditions of the 13th century Japanese monk named Nichiren, the group holds the Buddha's last sermon, the Lotus Sutra, as their most important religious text, and view chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra as a central part of their religious practice. Now, this is not that unique for early 1900s Japan, as the Soka Gakkai were one of many new religious movements based on Nichiren Buddhism that was founded during this time. Other popular examples of this would be the Reiyukai, as well as the Risho Koseikai. But, under the increasingly militaristic and authoritarian rule of the Japanese Empire, and with the start of the Second World War, their group began to face heavy persecution for not taking part in state-mandated Shinto rituals, honoring the divinity of the emperor, with the members of Soka Gakkai refusing to hang talismans from Ise Shrine that would honor the sun goddess Amaterasu, who is said to be the ancestor of all emperors of Japan. As a result of this, both Makaguchi and Toda were arrested and jailed by the Japanese authorities in 1943. After being imprisoned, Makaguchi would soon pass away the next year, but Toda would later be freed in 1945, shortly before Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, ending the war. And in the following years, the American-led occupation of Japan deconstructed the system of state Shinto, and Emperor Hirohito formally denied the divinity of the emperor in 1946, with the Allied powers going on to free several more political prisoners, and putting further legal protections in place on the freedom of religion. This allowed the newly freed members of Soka Gakkai to begin to organize into a formal religious institution under the leadership of Toda, with the group going from around 3,000 members at the end of the war to just over 1 million members by the start of the 1960s. With the members of Soka Gakkai becoming well known during this time for challenging their religious rivals to formal debates and arguments in the hopes of winning over more followers, with the movement even being known as the religion of the poor due to its popularity amongst the lower classes. Now, Soka Gakkai was not the only religion to rapidly grow in the post-war period, with this time often being referred to as the rush hour of the gods, due to the increased popularity of new religious movements in Japan, but also around the world. From the growth of Rastafarianism in Jamaica, the Unification Church in South Korea, to the rise of Indian gurus and the countercultural hippie movements of the United States and Europe. But, in 1958, Toda would end up passing away, leading there to be a leadership void for a few years, before the position was eventually filled by a young protege of his, named Ikeda Daisaku. Like many other members of Soka Gakkai, he came from a very poor family, But over the next 6 decades, he would go on to become the group's most important leader, and he would use this influence to greatly change the political and religious order of modern Japan. In order to help support this large religious community, Ikeda began to better organize the Soka Gakkai by establishing several formal institutions. In order to get more political representation, Ikeda helped found the first version of the Komeito, or Clean Government Party, in 1964, with the party dedicating itself to the singular Buddhist path of absolute pacifism. And in order to provide education and social mobility for its members, Ikeda established a network of Soka Gakkai affiliated schools, ranging from kindergartens to universities, in Japan and later China as well as the United States, with Ikeda also beginning to expand Soka Gakkai's international outreach during this time. And due to this formal structure, the Soka Gakkai and Komeito were able to grow more socially influential, as its members were able to better spread their faith and engage in political action by consistently voting and campaigning during election time. Now, the success of this movement in gaining followers during the post-war period was also a consequence of their main political and religious rivals failing to engage in the same level of outreach, even though they often shared similar views and political interests. Now, the Komeito's main rivals have historically been the Japanese Communist Party, with both the JCP and the Komeito actually supporting very similar policies. Both parties support increasing social welfare, pacifism, anti-nuclearism, and are generally against the remilitarization of Japan, with the JCP also sharing a very similar history to that of the Soka Gakkai, with members of the JCP being persecuted and imprisoned by the Japanese government due to their criticism of the emperor during World War II, with these members eventually being freed by the Americans, who also legalized the party after the end of the war. But as a result of their similarities, both parties competed against each other in order to gain the support of the same disaffected communities, who felt left behind by the great social and economic changes in post-war Japan, with the main groups being young adults, largely women, blue-collar workers, as well as the rural poor, who had begun moving into the cities from the countryside in order to find work. The JCP's base also included university students, while the Soka Gakkai also began reaching out to middle-class families. In addition to this, the JCP and the Soka Gakkai also attacked each other due to their views on the People's Republic of China. Now, despite also being communists, due to the JCP's commitment to pacifism and democracy, as well as their history of being persecuted by the Japanese Empire, the JCP became increasingly critical of the authoritarian and imperialistic rule of the Chinese Communist Party, most notably highlighted by the invasion of Tibet in 1950 and the brutal Cultural Revolution of 1966. With the JCP even going on to expel the anti-democratic members of the party who were sympathetic to the repressive regimes of China, the Soviet Union, and North Korea. Now, as opposed to the JCP, ever since the 1970s, the Soka Gakkai, in the hopes of fostering global pacifism, helped to establish informal as well as diplomatic connections to the ruling Chinese elite, in order to foster a peaceful relationship between the Japanese and Chinese governments. With Ikeda Daisaku first meeting Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai in the 1970s, and over the decades, the Soka school system has also produced many alumni who would go on to become very important figures in international politics. For example, Chen Yanghua, the Chinese ambassador to Japan from 2010 to 2019, is a graduate of the Soka University of Japan. Now, during this period of rapid growth from the 1950s to the 1970s, several controversies began to emerge against the Soka Gakkai, as critics, including several former members, began to write about their negative experiences with the group. They questioned the large donations some members were asked to pay, criticized the aggressive manner in which the Soka Gakkai would attempt to convert people, and voiced concerns about a religious congregation having its own political party. And as a result of these criticisms being picked up by popular tabloids, it resulted in the greater Japanese public largely developing a negative image of the Soka Gakkai, with the Soka Gakkai responding to these attacks by sponsoring their own positive publications. But as a result of there being these two binaries of harsh tabloid criticism and more optimistic organization-sponsored publications, it led there to be a lack of more nuanced scholarship on the Soka Gakkai for several decades. This resulted in the general public being ignorant of the everyday practice of the faith by ordinary people, and questions on how this small community was able to effectively grow to become one of the largest religious movements in Japan went unanswered. But more recent scholarship, done by academics such as Professor McLaughlin, have brought light to these once overlooked aspects of the faith, with Professor McLaughlin forwarding the idea that as a religion that welcomes so many people from the fringes of Japanese society, including social outcasts, the poor, and most notably women, The Soka Gakkai was able to very successfully create spaces for these historically marginalized groups to not only be accepted, but held up as role models in a manner that was not seen in traditional Japanese culture during this time. With the institutions established by the faith being very important as they gave its members a greater opportunity for social mobility through the school system and for greater political representation through the Komeito, and this was especially important for the women in the organization, as Japanese women were only allowed to vote in 1946 during the American-led occupation of Japan. Now, another reason why this social stigma emerged against the Soka Gakkai is possibly due to the fact that many members often avoid engaging in popular Japanese holidays and ceremonies. Now, in Japan, it is very common for a person to participate in Shinto celebrations, such as visiting a shrine for New Year's and making offerings at a Buddhist temple to honor their ancestors, all the while claiming to not be that religious, with a common description of Japanese religious practice being born Shinto and died Buddhist. But the Soka Gakkai are different, as they are an exclusive religion, meaning that members of Soka Gakkai often avoid engaging in rituals and practices from outside of their religion, such as when several early members of Soka Gakkai refused to hang up talismans to honor the Shinto sun goddess Amaterasu, leading them to be imprisoned during the Second World War. And as a result of avoiding these more mainstream religious practices, it has led members of Soka Gakkai to be looked on with suspicion, and even shunned by the general public. Now, it's important to emphasize that this is not unique to the Soka Gakkai, as several other religious minorities in Japan, most notably Christians, also avoid taking part in certain Japanese rituals and ceremonies, and as a result, they have also historically faced a similar level of social stigma, and even persecution. With the scholar of modern Japan, Professor Carol Gluck, forwarding the idea that since Japan is a largely homogeneous country, with close to 97% of the country being ethnically Japanese, religious minorities like Christians, who break existing cultural and religious norms, have come to fill the role of metaphorical foreigners in Japanese society, with Professor McLaughlin extending this analogy to include new religious movements, such as the Soka Gakkai. Now, another reason for this tension to exist between this more mainstream practice of religion and groups such as Japanese Christians and the Soka Gakkai is largely a result of there being two contrasting understandings of what a religion is in Japan, with the traditional understanding being defined by the historic practice of religion in the country, and the other, which has come to be known as Shukyo, being defined by a more Western Protestant understanding of religion. With this term first being adopted in Japan when the Americans opened up the country after several hundred years of isolation in 1853. This is because, along with bringing new Western technologies and sciences, the Americans also introduced new Western religious and legal concepts to Japan. And for these Western powers, in order for a group to be legally recognized as a religion, it had to include regular worship, such as going to church on Sunday, having a singular religious text, like the Bible, and include a strong yet private belief, such as a Christian's personal relationship with God. Religions also had to be exclusive, meaning that by being a member of one faith, you could not be a member of another. And there's also an expectation for religion to be separate from government, with all these qualifications coincidentally lining up with the practice of Protestant Christianity in 1800s America. But, at the same time, by introducing this new legal term for religion, it also created qualifications and a framework for new religious movements in the 1900s, like the Soka Gakkai, to look at if they wanted to be officially recognized as a religion. The only problem was that since this legal definition of religion originated in Western Protestant Christianity, it often clashed with the historic practice of religion in Japan in several ways. Firstly, Japanese religious traditions were not set around a specific worship schedule, with the exception of certain holidays. And as opposed to just one central religious text like the Bible, Japan has several Buddhist canons and Shinto scriptures, with rituals such as ceremonial hand-washing and making offerings at a temple also being seen as being more important than personal beliefs. And in the nearly 1500 years of Buddhism and Shinto coexisting in Japan, they have combined and overlapped a great deal, making it very easy for Japanese people to mix and match Buddhist and Shinto practices in their daily lives. There was also no historic expectation for the Japanese government to be separate from religion. For example, the emperor was seen as a descendant of a Shinto sun goddess. Political officials had sponsored Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines for hundreds of years, and there have even been records of Buddhist monks from rival temples becoming important military leaders throughout Japanese history. Therefore, as a result of there being two competing understandings of religion, a social stigma against a group, and the Soka Gakkai's history of being persecuted during the Second World War, the group began to develop a sense of not just being their own religion, but of also being a distinct community. with many members of Soka Gakkai connecting their history of persecution back to the life of the monk Nichiren, who is said to have come from a lower-class background and was often attacked for challenging the religious and governmental order of 13th century Japan, leading him to be exiled and almost executed on several occasions. But at the same time, in response to these criticisms and scandals, the Komeito and the Soka Gakkai did end up making reforms over the years. The two organizations formally separated in 1970, and as a result of this, the Komeito dropped their explicitly Buddhist platform and gradually began to transform into a pacifist social welfare party, with the party mainly focusing on helping the poor and the Japanese working class. The Soka Gakkai also began toning down their conversion and fundraising campaigns, and instead began inviting people to tithe, as well as holding more casual conversations on faith. But despite this separation, there's still a close relationship between the two organizations, as the majority of the Komeito supporters still come from the Soka Gakkai. But despite this rapid growth in the post-war period, both the Komeito and the JCP would remain very minor players in Japanese national politics, with much of Japan's post-war political order being defined by the 1955 system. This was where the gigantic Liberal Democratic Party would rule the country against an opposition led by the Japanese Socialist Party, with the LDP being the single most successful party in modern Japan, as they have largely been able to rule the country by themselves, from the 1950s until the 1990s. Now, the 1990s were an extremely difficult period for Japan, as it experienced a series of unfortunate events that disrupted the political, economic, and religious order of the country. Now, ever since they were first founded, the Soka Gakkai have been part of a much larger Nichiren Buddhist organization, called the Nichiren Shoshu. However, due to conflicts between the leadership of the two organizations, Nichiren Shoshu ended up excommunicating all members of Soka Gakkai in 1991. This resulted in Nichiren Shoshu losing almost 95% of its membership, because they were part of Soka Gakkai. 2 years later, in 1993, the country was shocked when the LDP was removed from power for the first time, when an 8-party coalition, which included the Komeito, took power, and with the collapse of the Japanese Socialist Party a few years later, this ended the 1955 system and began the coalition era of Japanese politics, where now, instead of having the LDP rule by themselves against a socialist-led minority, in this new political order, multiple parties would need to come together and form a coalition in order to help run the country. This was further exacerbated by a series of political reforms in 1994 that produced a new electoral system. Now, like the United Kingdom or Canada, Japan has a parliamentary system made up of the National Diet with an upper and lower house, with the lower house of representatives being the most important, as they are the ones who have the final say in choosing the prime minister, confirming cabinet members, and passing new legislation. And as a result of these reforms, it established a new system where voters will be able to send in 2 votes during election time. 1 vote in their local district for a single candidate, and 1 vote in their greater region for the preferred political party. For the local vote, the country is first divided into several hundred unequally populated districts, ranging from around 200,000 to almost 500,000 people each, with each district sending in 1 representative to the Diet, with these local district representatives making up about 2/3 of the lower house, with the remaining 1/3 of the house coming from the proportional lists. Here, the country is divided up into 11 regions, and given a number of representatives based on the population of each region. Each party then runs a list of candidates in each region, with the representatives then being proportionally divided up among the parties, based on how many votes they got. This allows smaller parties a chance to send in representatives to the National Diet. The order candidates get chosen from the proportional lists are also determined by the individual parties, giving more experienced politicians a chance to run on both the local level and the party list, a measure often used to make sure more senior members of the party can remain in parliament no matter what. And in the middle of all this change, Japan's post-war economic boom began to slow down, and the country began to enter a period of economic stagnation that has lasted well into the 2020s. Wages began to drop, and many people were left unemployed, leading there to be a great deal of economic anxiety amongst the public. Then the next year, in 1995, the country would be hit by a series of national tragedies. First, an earthquake struck the city of Kobe in January, but as the Japanese government failed to quickly provide aid to its victims, several religious organizations, and even the Yakuza, stepped in to help distribute aid. However, these religious groups also ended up being heavily criticized in the media because they were seen as helping the members of their congregation first. Then, a few months later, a gas attack on the Tokyo subway by a doomsday cult called Amun left 13 people dead and over 1,000 people injured. And as a result of these two tragedies, It led the public to have an extremely negative view on religious organizations. As a result, after the LDP eventually returned to power as part of a coalition government, the Diet ended up passing a law that gave the government more power to supervise religious groups by monitoring their finances and restricting their involvement in politics. However, several academics and political commentators voiced concerns that this law could be used to target other groups, such as the Soka Gakkai, as retaliation for the Komeito helping to defeat the LDP. But that didn't happen. In fact, the opposite occurred. Instead of continuing to compete against each other, the LDP and the Komeito decided to work together and form a coalition, which has gone on to become the longest-lasting political alliance in modern Japanese history. This surprised many people, because several early founders of the LDP were also members of the Imperial Japanese government during the Second World War, and were involved in the persecution of the Soka Gakkai. And since Japanese political parties are very generational, this meant that the literal children and grandchildren of the Imperial persecutors and their Soka Gakkai victims had ended up joining forces in this new political alliance. Despite all this, the Komeito saw this coalition with the LDP as an opportunity for them to actually govern and pass laws for the first time on the national level after being a small opposition party for several decades. And the LDP saw the Komeito as a powerful ally because the party is able to consistently mobilize around 8 million voters during election time, with this accounting for about 16% of all voters in Japan. This is important because one reason why the LDP has been able to remain in power for so long is because the local district elections use the first past the post system, which means whoever gets the most votes wins. This has benefited the LDP, as with a small but committed voter base and a highly divided opposition, the vote is often split between several rival parties, allowing the LDP to win without having to get a majority of the votes, with the party actually not having won a majority of the popular vote since 1963. And as a result of this new alliance, the LDP and the Komeito decided that instead of continuing to split the vote, they would work together instead to strengthen each other's chances of winning. For example, when a popular LDP candidate is running in a local district, both LDP and Komeito supporters would vote for them. And in a district where a popular Komeito candidate is running, both Komeito and LDP supporters would vote for them, with each party being free to support their respective candidates in the regional proportional lists. This has allowed the Komeito to gain a great deal of support because despite being a relatively small party, during election time, 25 to 30% of all LDP votes in certain districts come from the Komeito and their Soka Gakkai base. And since many of these local elections are often won by a few thousand or even a few hundred votes, this makes the Komeito and their Soka Gakkai base very influential, as the LDP need their support in order to remain in power. And as a result of this, the Komeito political leadership has been able to leverage this support to make deals with the LDP, where in exchange for supporting certain issues that are important to the Liberal Democratic Party, the Komeito are allowed to promote their interests as well as rewrite and moderate LDP legislation, so it's more in line with the Komeito interest for general social welfare as well as pacifism, with the most important group within the Komeito's voter base being the Soka Gakkai's Married Women's Association. Now, Japan remains a very conservative country when it comes to gender roles, and despite progress over the years, this has led Japan to have historically low levels of women's participation in politics, as well as the workforce. And within Japan, members of Soka Gakkai are considered to be even more traditional when it comes to gender roles, with there being an expectation that a family should consist of a man who is the main breadwinner, and a woman who stays at home, looks after the children, and takes care of other family members. As a result of this, men largely dominate the elected leadership of the Komeito. However, this has also led the Married Women's Association to become very powerful. This is because they are the ones who are mainly responsible for raising money by selling Soka Gakkai publications, converting new members to the faith, as well as organizing campaigns during election time, with these women being the ones responsible for mobilizing around 8 million voters to turn out and vote for the Komeito LDP alliance, with this support resulting in the Komeito having some of the highest and most consistent voter turnout rates in Japanese electoral history. And due to this ability to mobilize voters on election day, it has allowed the Married Women's Association to have a final say when it comes to approving legislation for the Komeito, with the main concerns of the Married Women's Association often being very specific to Japanese mothers and housewives. This includes issues related to better paid maternity leave, making education costs more affordable, and cutting taxes on household goods. But at the same time, the association is also very interested in increasing social welfare for the more marginalized members of society. This includes the elderly, the chronically ill or disabled, and most notably, single parents, with each of these groups suffering from a significant amount of poverty in Japan. For example, in Japan, 1 in 4 elderly women and 1 in 10 elderly men live in poverty, with almost 25% of disabled people also living below the poverty line. And about half of all single-parent households in Japan, mainly single mothers, also live below the poverty line, with a great deal of this poverty often being hidden from public view. Now, in the Kōmeitō LDP alliance, even though the LDP is organized as one large political party, there are several different wings and factions within the party itself, with each faction having their own political interests and local supporters, who often compete against each other as much as they would compete against other political parties in order to gain more influence and power within the government. Therefore, instead of seeing this alliance as just one large political party and one small political party, it would be more accurate to describe the Komeito as one of many factions within this ruling alliance. And similar to the Komeito-Soka Gakkai relationship, the various LDP factions also align themselves with different religious organizations in order to help gather volunteers and mobilize voters during election time. And this includes several rival Nichiren Buddhist denominations to the Soka Gakkai, such as the Ryukai and the Risho Kosekai, as well as several Shinto organizations, such as the Association of Shinto Shrines. And in the light of the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, it was also discovered that his family had a generations-long connection to the Unification Church of South Korea. Now, when looking further into the Komeito, the party itself is divided into competing factions. This is because despite the close relationship between the Komeito and their Soka Gakkai supporters, ever since the two organizations separated in 1970, they gradually began to grow apart, with tensions emerging between the two, as the Komeito began to make political deals with the LDP in order to maintain their alliance. For example, during the war in Iraq, the Komeito accepted that Japan should send some members of the Japanese Self-Defense Forces to the Middle East, not to fight, but to help with humanitarian aid. However, there's a great deal of backlash from their Soka Gakkai supporters, who wanted the party to remain pacifist and not engage in any wars at all. This has led two prominent factions to emerge within the Komeito and their Soka Gakkai supporters, and they could best be described as the pragmatists and the idealists. The pragmatists don't want to lose their influence within Japanese politics by risking their relationship with LDP. Therefore, they are willing to leverage their electoral support to enact gradual change over time in order to promote their social welfare interests. While the idealists from the Soka Gakkai have become increasingly critical of the Komeito, as they do not want them to give up on their founding Buddhist principles, with the most important one being promoting international pacifism. And this divide has only grown larger during the 2010s as the leader of the Soka Gakkai, Ikeda Daisaku, started to take a less active role in the leadership of the organization, with Ikeda eventually passing away in late 2023, at the age of 95, causing a great deal of trauma for members of the Soka Gakkai. Now, in recent years, due to the success of the LDP-Komeito alliance, it has made the Komeito a target of other smaller political parties in Japan, who have attempted to take their place in the coalition in order to gain influence at the national level, with the most recent challengers being the Japan Innovation Party, which largely draws their support from around Osaka. However, the main issue concerning the Komeito is a common one faced by many other political parties in Japan. The party membership is getting very old, and due to the lack of youth interest in politics, there's a lack of younger politicians and voters to take their place, with only about 30% of young people in Japan even voting, with more than half of all Japanese voters being at least 59 years old. This has led the Komeito voter base to gradually shrink from around 8 million voters to just 6 million in recent years, with the growth of the Soka Gakkai also slowing down ever since the late 1970s, with most members of the religion mainly being the children, grandchildren, or even great-grandchildren of the first generation of converts. But, in spite of all this, even if the Komeito voter base would drop to just 2 million voters, they would still have one of the largest and most consistent voting bases in Japan, which means that for the foreseeable future, they will be an important ally for the LDP, if they want to remain in power. Another issue is that since the much larger Liberal Democratic Party has been in power for almost 70 years, this has led them to be seen as a more practical option for many people if they would want to get involved in politics. Now, despite all these challenges, the Komeito have been able to remain an important force in Japanese politics for the better part of 20 years, being one of the few parties to go from being part of the opposition to becoming a long-term partner in the ruling Japanese government. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Please let me know what you think, And if there was anything I missed, or if there are any other interesting facts you think are important, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Let me know what you think of Japanese politics, the Komeito, or the Soka Gakkai. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks to my patrons, Antroid and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.